A new report finds that some states go above and beyond when it comes to protecting religious freedom, while others lag behind. Stay tuned, and we'll discuss the implications here on Faith and Politics. Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our guest panelists for today. First, we have Mr. Rashawn Baker, President and CEO of the Baker Strategy Group. We also have with us Mr. Todd McFarland, General Counsel for the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We also have Mr. Tim Schultz, who's the president of the First Amendment Partnership, and we have Mr. Andre Wong, who's the General Counsel of the North Pacific Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Gentlemen, good having you here with us and looking forward to our conversation for today. You know, there's some states that are more proactive than others in protecting religious freedom. A new report from the First Liberty Institute Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy found that Florida ranked first in the reports, which is up from sixth place a few years ago. Montana and Illinois follow in second and third place, respectively, with Utah landing at number 9. West Virginia, meanwhile, came in last among all 50 states. Religious liberty protections that go way beyond what we would be looking for sometimes exist here, but in other states, it looks like it's quite limited. You know, Tim Schultz, when I look at these reports that come out, and they come out on an annual basis, and sometimes you wonder, is this real or is this made up, or where do they actually figure this out? But somehow Florida's number 1, West Virginia is at the end. How do we assess all of this, or does it really make a big difference at all?
Well, there's 3 things about this report. One is that the report is clearly a work that took a long time and they put a lot of thought into. I would recommend that everybody look at it, and I hope that you somehow link to it in the show notes, because I think it's a worthy project that they've done. I like First Liberty. I think they're a good organization, and I've done a lot of work with them in the states. And as you know, First Amendment Partnership does a lot of work in state capitals. Now, having said all of those positive things, I respectfully think that I don't agree with the major conclusions in the report, because when you put a report together like this, you have to make some methodological assumptions up front about how you're going to weigh various things. So, for instance, I think it's really important that states have a Religious Freedom Restoration Act, okay? Really important, what the Supreme Court has called it a super statute. But to me, weighing that at the same level as whether a state has, for instance, a vaccine opt-out for religion, and that's what the report does, I just don't think those two things are the same, and I don't think they should be weighed in the same way. You know, the Florida Supreme Court had a case about 15 years ago that basically read their own state RFRA to almost have no force whatsoever. So that's another factor that's not weighed in the report. So in the end, I think the report's actually an incredible work product, but I think that the assumptions that they made up front are probably, I would take gentle and respectful issue with. But I also think that the report does show that there are lots of things states can do to protect religious liberty and law. And I think that's good. I think people understanding how much states can do, that's a really valuable contribution. And I salute First Liberty for having done that.
Yeah, to me, first of all, Tim, I agree with what you've said. To me, the report seems more political than that of protecting religious liberty. I think Florida shoots to the top because it's turned more conservative. So if you're coming from a strictly Christian base, then you're very happy with the report. But if you're coming from one, which it should be, is to protect all faith and those who have no faith. So if you're doing that, you're not happy with what things are going on in Florida, and I think some of the other places that you see taking place. So I think that's where it skews it. It's more political when, as Tim said, talking about vaccines and other things that you see coming out of the current administration that lean toward that. So that's my take on it.
Also you talk about being a political document, but how it sort of goes. Really, Illinois is number 3. I mean, that is a state where I would not want to be litigating a lot of religious freedom issues. While it does have a state RFRA, that's more of a legacy issue, and the state Supreme Court there and other states have not applied that in a consistent way. And so, yeah, listen, anytime you come up with one of these lists, people are going to take issue with it. And, they did come up with a lot of different metrics, and as Tim said, put a lot of work into it. I would also point out, and Rashawn, you can close your ears on this one, but Maryland is number 12. I mean, like right now, I have a lawsuit against the state of Maryland because they're trying to tell us at our world headquarters who we can hire and not hire, right? And so I think that needs to be a factor as well. So, again, but I do think the important part of this is it gets people thinking about and looking at what states can and cannot do. And that, I believe this is the first one of these they've done. Is that correct? And so they might work in the methodology a little bit more. But yeah, there are some interesting outcomes here.
Well, and Todd, to interject, I think other groups have endeavored to do things like this also. It's incredibly labor intensive. I mean, you look at the scope and the number of statutes that they're looking at. This almost certainly required thousands of staff hours to compile. So again, I salute the effort. This is a significant thing of research, but I also agree. I love Maryland and I live here. Maryland ain't number 12.
Well, Andre, I got to ask you the question, are states really clamoring to be number 1? I mean, this is going out there. This is kind of giving this feel of this is an important topic. But we're in a society where people are thinking that religious issues are like under decline and really more things are getting more secular. Is this something that really your average state leadership team even cares about nowadays?
Yeah, I think what this report reveals is that we're really seeing 2 approaches to religious freedom in the states. In red states, we're seeing what some call a permissive model of religious freedom, broad opt-outs from school requirements, freedom of conscience protections for doctors, exemptions from certain public service mandates, strong religious accommodation laws in the workplace. So the idea is that government should bend when an individual's faith is at stake. Freedom means freedom from coercion. But then in blue states, we see them moving into what some call an integration model, one that emphasizes uniform public services, non-discrimination, consistent rules for everyone, right? So that means fewer religious opt-outs, more requirements on healthcare providers, tighter limits on when personal belief can override access to patients or consumers. And so the idea there is equal participation in public life requires a level playing field, and exemptions can sometimes become a license to discriminate. So that goes to Rashawn's point. So in some ways, we do see a 2-party system of religious freedom in the states. A religious objection that protects you in one state might expose you to liability in another. So that raises deeper questions. Should religious freedom rights be uniform nationwide, or is variation the whole point of federalism, that each state reflects its own culture and its own values?
Rashawn, as somebody who's been in the State House, is this a topic that actually floats around? Many consider it always a bipartisan kind of issue when we talk about religious liberty and religious freedom, but you've been in that hall, hearing people talk, seeing things come up. Does the religious connotation aspect actually come into play at all?
Yeah, I think Andre hit it right on the head. Actually, it does now more than it did when I was in the legislature in the 90s, because we have become a state, a federal government of 2 parts of how you look at religious freedom. Before, it was making sure that the state and the federal government didn't infringe upon your religious freedom. Now is which states, have a doctrine of, if it's more conservative, so more Christian, it's putting more restriction. If you take a place like Maryland, which is reacting to what goes on in the federal level, so they're more going to be trying to make sure that it's across the board, that it doesn't impact on anyone's religion, which sometimes takes it too far. And that's what I fear, is that we're going to see the pendulum swing in states that are too far to the left and too far to the right, where they should be down the middle.
One thing I will say, and I apologize, I had not read the report carefully enough. This is the fourth year they've done it, not the first. So just want to make sure I correct that. But, it's also interesting. It also depends on which protections are important to you, right? So California and New York both rank very low, 43 and 45 respectively. But if you need a holy day accommodation, historically, those two states were very strong. California had a higher standard for years. We now have a higher one based thanks to a First Liberty case, Groff. New York has had a higher one. And also culturally, New York, I think it's to a large Jewish population in part and stronger protections, has also protected people on holy day accommodations in that state more than others. So again, I don't even see that really was a factor in their scoring, but it also depends on what you need. And, and certain things like healthcare mandates and so forth, like, how important that is to you. Vaccine exemptions, like that may not be important to you at all.
Yeah.
And in fact, most denominations, most religions don't even have a objection to vaccines. So it does reflect the values of the two researchers. This is, we don't have a set, understood, agreed to definition of what is strong religious protections in this country. And so, the researchers had to make some calls there, and that's going to really depend on where your view of religious freedom is.
But Tim Schultz, I think your point is it does create the dialogue. It does give us some parameters in which to operate. And I think doing this type of work establishes that there's a certain level of importance in really engaging in religious freedom from a protection standpoint, and also protecting those who may not be concerned with religion at all. And I guess this does kind of like give us what I would call, a playing field to understand where everyone is just generally, and then you can make your adjustments thereof, because one of the things that was mentioned is there are a number of states that improved since the last report was taken.
I mean, I think that the two most valuable things that come out of this are it shows the breadth of places where government and religious freedom might come into conflict, and that's helpful. And there are a lot of them. I mean, they have over 40 different things listed in the report. I think that's helpful. I think they also show that state legislatures have a lot of running room on what they can do to protect religious liberty or to oppose it or to infringe upon it. I think that's very helpful. To Andre's earlier point about whether we ought to have state variation or one sort of single standard, I think the answer in a federalist system is both. But I do think we should always be reminded that the free exercise of religion is part of the United States Constitution. It's in the First Amendment. It's why we call ourselves the First Amendment Partnership. It does apply to everybody, and it applies to all states. It applies to all actions of government at every level. Now, that doesn't mean that we have all of the questions answered by the First Amendment, and that's why we have legislation that sort of comes in behind that. It's a belt and suspenders type of thing. But I do think we do have a single, very important core federal standard that was part of the founding of the country. And then we do have state variation. And I think on balance, it would be better for states to look to protect religious freedom as much as they possibly can.
Andre, were you surprised at the ranking from your part of the country, which is generally considered to be pretty secular?
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing is a philosophical split, freedom as exemption versus freedom as equal treatment. And at some point, the U.S. Supreme Court is going to have to decide whether these two visions can exist.
Well, I'm going to have to let that be the last word, but I think this is some good work that we can continue to use as kind of a platform. And hopefully what it will do is get us in a better space as it relates to protecting religious freedom. Coming up, a recent court decision says a state cannot exclude foster parents from adoption simply for holding religious beliefs. A win for religious freedom, or is it more complicated? Stick around, we'll be right back. When faith and government collide, the issues can be complex and consequential. Faith and Politics explores how religious conviction intersects with law, policy, and public life, offering depth, balance, and clarity with meaningful discussion and trusted insight. To see a bunch of our previous episodes, check us out at faithandpolitics.tv and subscribe to us on YouTube. There's a case out there that's called Bates versus Pakseresht. An Oregon Christian mom can now begin the process of adoption while her lawsuit moves forward after the state blocked her application due to her Christian views on gender ideology. Jessica Bates is a widowed mother of 5, described in court documents as being a devout Christian who wants to adopt 2 young children, but she was barred from doing so because her religious beliefs clashed with Oregon's adoption policies. The state actually requires their prospective parents who adopt children from foster care to agree to respect, accept, and support the child's gender identity and expression. You know, Todd, we find ourselves in a society that's always looking for parents and new homes for foster children, and now it looks like there's some type of religious litmus test in order to move forward. I mean, is this a bridge too far, or is this still protecting children?
Orland, this is a perfect example of bureaucracy and ideology just going too far and harming the population that is pretending to protect. This false dichotomy of to protect individuals' gender identity and excluding religious people is purely been created in the minds of ideological advocates and bureaucrats. We had a situation which was cited in the Ninth Circuit case, Blaze, in which the grandparents of a multi-month infant, she had been born just a few months ago, were forced to confirm that as a teenager, she wanted to have change her gender, that they would take her to the doctor's treatments for her gender change medications that she would take. An absolute insane question to ask about an infant, right? Another situation we had in the state of Washington that was going on, or had gone on shortly before our case, a couple of boys, teenage boys, had been taken into custody by some neighbors that they had friends, sort of an emergency basis. They wanted to keep them more full-time, and so applied for a foster license. Even though neither boy was gay or transgender, the state of Washington yanked them, or tried to yank them out of that home to put them in a different foster home because they wouldn't answer these ideological questions correctly. States, whether or not the correct way to handle and protect transgender kids is, I think, very much of a debate, but states have a lot of options rather than making every single person, regardless of their religious belief, bow the knee to the state's gender ideology.
Yeah, the court here said that Oregon's rule likely violates both the free speech clause and the religious free exercise clause. So, as Todd mentioned, the state wasn't just asking for basic care, but ideological alignment, that the parent support and accept certain views about gender and sexuality as defined by the state. So in the court's view, this wasn't neutral. It was compelled speech, forcing a parent to express, endorse, and model messages that they have religious objections to. So it wasn't just generally applicable either. The rule, as applied, burdened religious parents in a way that secular parents would not experience. So under the First Amendment, that triggered strict scrutiny. So the Ninth Circuit's bottom line here is clear. You can't shut the door to an otherwise qualified foster parent simply because she won't pledge allegiance or support a state-approved ideology. And that's not how the First Amendment works.
Tim Schultz, how do we balance this? We obviously want to look out for the best interests of children, but in the same breath, really this almost tells you as a parent, you almost don't get to raise your child with your own personal religious beliefs. And that seems like that's a really dangerous and slippery slope to get on.
Well, I think that the normal way you do that balancing is that you look at whether an individual child is a good fit for an individual family. It may be that a transgender identifying 16-year-old is not a good fit for a deeply religious family that totally rejects the whole idea that you can have a gender identity separate from your sex. That may not, in fact, be a good fit in the foster system. But what is happening, and I think it's really important to know that this is not an isolated incident, right? This case in these couple of states, there have been a few cases in other states as well. Judges in other states have come out differently on this question about whether the prospective parent should win. So the idea that we ought to disqualify all parents who don't subscribe to certain views about gender It's not an anomaly. It's actually happening all over the country. There have now been dozens of cases. There have been a few states that have passed laws to prevent that from happening. But there are a bunch of other states that are quite proud that they are disqualifying parents entirely from the system based upon beliefs about gender that are at odds with the state. And what are those beliefs, Orlin? Because I think you've used the term gender ideology. It's really important, I think, for us to kind of define what are we talking about. These states believe that there is a thing called gender identity that is separate from your sex. And that's why they use terms like sex assigned at birth, right? Because it's not a sex that you observe at birth. It's a sex that is sort of arbitrarily assigned at birth. And then every person, everybody, not just sort of a rare set of individuals, but everyone has a potential gender identity separate from their, quote, sex assigned at birth. And it's up to them to ultimately claim and discover that. And then once they do, it has to be accepted and respected without any pushback whatsoever, because to do so would be to engage in something that they call conversion therapy, which we know from the history with gay and lesbian people is this sort of very discredited practice. That's what we're talking about here. And that may sound, I don't know, almost conspiratorial, but no, that is the live question on the ground now all across America.
You know, Sharon, I don't know how we actually even delve into, finding a balance here of some sort, because on one hand, you have thousands or maybe even millions of children that are looking for homes, and then you're putting these rules in place and make the whole process even more difficult.
No, I think everyone has talked about this correctly, and that is, once again, we've gone too far. If you think about all this stuff starts coming up when we had this debate about same-sex couples adopting and getting foster care. What we want are good parents. There's a mechanism in the state, as somebody who served in the state legislature and served as a county executive, I can tell you there are things in place in the foster care system to make sure you get the best fit with the parent and the child. But it is the parent. And you want these folks to treat their children like they would any other child they have. As me as a parent, children are going to have difference with their parents as they grow older. But this is something where the state is trying to do, and it's always a problem, is trying to predict the future about these children and making everyone follow the same rules, rather than saying, are these fit parents for these much needed children? As somebody who ran a foster care system as county executive, I can tell you there are not enough parents out there. So we don't want restrictions other than we want good, caring, loving families for these children. And then those things that come about as they grow older, they will deal with them. But this is, once again, the state stepping in and setting out strict rules that infringe upon us finding great homes for these children. And I think that's where they've gone too far. And I think the court decided it rightly.
I agree with Rashawn and Orlin, if I may. And sorry, Todd looked like he wanted to jump in, but I'm beating him to the punch, like it's we're on Jeopardy here, and I buzzed in earlier. Studies show that there are two groups of people that are massively overrepresented, Orlin, in the foster system. It's parents who are deeply religious, and it's parents who identify as LGBT. And of course, those groups may have some overlap with each other. But the point is that, anybody who's ever dealt with the foster system knows, man, we need as many hands on deck as possible. And to completely disqualify more or less one really big chunk of your potential foster parenting, options in the name of so-called protection for LGBT people strikes me as a really bad cost-benefit trade-off driven by nothing more than ideology, not actually in the best interest of all those kids that are in the foster system.
And that's exactly what I was going to say, Orlin, is that's what's so pernicious about this, right, is it starts excluding the exact group that wants to be here. And it is entirely hypothetical because, as, Rashawn said, one of the things they do is match up people. So when we were litigating in the state of Washington, one of the areas we were exploring was, so for instance, there are certain foster kids who are deeply disabled, right? Medically, cognitively, other ways, and you may have to have very specialized training to do that. You may not, you may be, what if you're in an apartment on the third floor and there's no elevator, right? And they don't disqualify because you can't take care of this deeply disabled kids. In other words, not every foster parent has to be able to foster every foster kid. And that's something they get, going to Andre's point about generally applicable and neutral, that's what they get in other contexts. But suddenly, in this very small number of kids that, minors that feel a desire to go through gender transition as teenagers, suddenly this one has to be a universal test that all foster parents have to go. In fact, the fact that the Ninth Circuit, hardly a conservative bastion, saw this, the fact that a district court judge in the state of Washington, again, hardly a conservative bastion, saw this, I think just shows how this needs to be reined in. One other last thing, too, that Tim and I talked about this a few months ago, maybe more like a year or two ago. He had asked me whether I thought this was a large nationwide issue. I was like, I said it probably is just mostly in blue states, but I think that turned out to be wrong, even though we're talking about a deeply blue state here in Oregon, because the people in a lot of red states that run these programs go to all the conferences and sort of implemented this on their own, even without sort of a formal state policy, right, or a formal state law. So this comes up not just in blue states, but also in red states as well. And it's something I think the courts need to get a handle on. And this should be a solvable problem, because the reality is we do need more, not fewer, foster parents, and religious foster parents can fit that bill and be quality for the vast majority of foster kids.
Andre, I went to a church on the West Coast in which this was part of the ministry of the church, encouraging members to actually look for foster kids and also adoptions. And that church had actually engaged in 50 couples who had never thought about it before were now part of the system. I mean, this can be a ministry of a church. Yeah,
and I think that this is something every state is struggling with this tension of how to protect LGBTQ youth in foster care while also honoring the constitutional rights of parents who may hold traditional or religious beliefs. It's just that here in Oregon, it went further. It required not just competence, but affirmation. And ultimately, the Ninth Circuit said no.
Well, I think we got probably the right decision here, and looking out for the right balance between children and connecting the right parents is what it's really all about, but we should never allow religion to be the litmus test. Hey, Rashern, tell me something I don't know.
Well, Orland, I'm spending the month studying John Quincy Adams, and he was a fighter for religious freedom. So much so, they actually joined the anti-Mason party after he left the White House. Did you know that?
Didn't know that. Andre, tell me something I don't know.
Thomas Jefferson refused to issue Thanksgiving proclamations during his presidency because he felt it was akin to supporting state-sponsored religion. But oddly enough, he did do it once as governor of Virginia.
Wow. Tim Schultz, tell me something I don't know.
Orland, you asked earlier in the discussion of Florida and state policy whether states should vie to be number one on this list. And to that, I'm going to quote the legendary NASCAR driver, deeply religious, the pride of Talladega, Florida, Ricky Bobby, who said, "If you ain't first, you're last."
Todd, tell me something I don't know.
Speaking of the state of Florida, fun fact, did you know the state of Florida is the flattest state in the union? And my home state of Illinois came in as number 2.
I didn't know that. Gentlemen, it was a great conversation today. Looking forward to doing it again. And thanks again for you being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.